Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a truly unbelievable historical reversal. We're looking at how a virtually completely dominated Europe in July of 1940 systematically transformed into the total, absolute defeat of Adolf Hitler's empire. It's an incredible story of fierce resistance, massive strategic blunders, and a global alliance that literally reshaped the world we live in today. Let's dive in. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Britain's last stand. Then look at the Soviet invasion mistake, followed by the turning point at Stalingrad. Then we'll cover D-Day and two fronts, and finally, Hitler's final defeat. Section 1. Britain's last stand. Standing alone against the German war machine. Okay, picture this. It's 1940, and Hitler has already occupied practically all of surrounding Europe. Austria, Poland, Norway, Belgium, Denmark, France, they had all fallen. And because Germany had a peace agreement with the Soviets at the time, Britain was left completely and utterly isolated. Hitler fully expected Winston Churchill to just cave and sign a peace treaty. But instead, Churchill delivered this absolutely iconic speech to his people. By declaring they would never surrender, he proved that the raw motivation of defending your actual homeland creates this unyielding force against a conqueror's ambition. The war wasn't over, it was going to continue. Now, to pull off his planned land invasion, which was called Operation Sea Lion, Hitler absolutely had to control the skies. But the numerical contrast here is just wild. The German Luftwaffe was boasting 2,600 aircraft, while the British Royal Air Force had a mere 700? I mean, on paper, that looks like a completely impossible defense. But then comes September 15th, 1940. Battle of Britain Day. Hitler ordered this massive, all-out attack on London, filling the sky with over 1,000 aircraft. But the fiercely motivated British miraculously held their ground and crushed the assault. Downed German aircraft actually outpaced British losses 2-1. This handed Hitler his very first major loss of the war, and it forced him to completely abandon his invasion plans for Britain. A total game changer. Moving on to Section 2, the Soviet invasion mistake. Hitler's two-front fatal error. So instead of finishing the job with Britain, Hitler makes a massive pivot. He actually breaks his non-aggression pact to attack the Soviet Union. Why? Well, it was driven by pure megalomania, a deep hatred of communists, and this obsession with global supremacy. He divides his forces into three distinct paths: north toward Leningrad, central toward Moscow, and south right through Ukraine. He was trying to recreate his early blitzkrieg successes, and honestly, the initial speed was terrifying. They advanced 100 kilometers in just 2 days. Now, you might be wondering about their military strength. On the ground, the numbers actually heavily favored the Soviets, who had 20,000 tanks compared to Germany's 6,000, yet Hitler initially kept the upper hand. He used vastly superior tactical and technological advancements to push his troops incredibly deep into Soviet territory, getting to within just 300 kilometers of Moscow. But then, the freezing, brutal Russian winter sets in, and it severely stalls the German advance. And right as the momentum started shifting in Europe, the global chessboard was completely reset. In December of 1941, Japan's unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor forced a reluctant America into the conflict. So now, the U.S. is officially joining the Allied forces alongside Britain and the Soviet Union. Which brings us to Section 3, the turning point at Stalingrad, the deadliest battle of the war. This is the moment the momentum of the entire global conflict completely flips. 300,000. That is the staggering number of German troops who suddenly found themselves entirely surrounded by incredibly resilient Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad. The brutal, devastating fighting dragged on until February 1943, when those surrounded German forces were finally forced to surrender. It was, without a doubt, the ultimate turning point of World War II. And the Axis powers were crumbling elsewhere too. Down in Italy, civilians had absolutely had enough. Actually, here's a fascinating fact. The famous song Bella Ciao, which you might actually recognize from modern pop culture, originated right around this time. It was sung by Italian partisans taking up arms for their cause. They rose up, overthrew, and famously executed the dictator Mussolini, which really just goes to show you the sheer power of civilian resistance against fascism. Section 4. D-Day and two fronts. The massive squeeze on German forces. So with Mussolini gone and the Soviets pushing back hard in the east, Allied leaders met in Tehran to coordinate this final massive squeeze on the German war machine. And that assault unleashed a massive figure, 150,000. On June 6, 1944, which we all know as D-Day, This enormous force of British, American, and Canadian soldiers landed directly on the beaches of Normandy, France. Hitler was officially caught in his absolute worst nightmare, a full-scale two-front war. Because of the overwhelming pressure from D-Day in the West, Hitler had to desperately withdraw his troops from the Soviet Union just to defend himself. The Soviets immediately capitalized on that weakness. They launched a massive counterattack, rapidly regaining 600 kilometers of territory in just 2 months. They systematically swept through and liberated Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania from German occupation. And that leads us right into Section 5, Hitler's final defeat, the collapse of the empire. Now, as the Allied forces systematically dismantled the last remaining strongholds, we really have to pause here to acknowledge the immense human cost. The last 4 months of the conflict were agonizingly painful, with a staggering 30,000 people being killed every single day. And even worse, as the Allies pushed deeper into German territory, they made the horrifying discovery of Hitler's concentration camps, where hundreds of thousands of innocent Jews had been cruelly murdered. It was a deeply grim, tragic reminder of exactly what the Allies were fighting to stop. From there, the final collapse happened with incredible speed. In February 1945, the Yalta Conference laid out the groundwork for the final push. By May, Soviet troops had completely surrounded Berlin. Knowing that defeat was totally inevitable, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. And just over a week later, on May 8th, Germany signed its formal surrender. The map of the world was forever changed. Out of the ashes of this unprecedented global tragedy, the victors knew without a doubt that they had to build systems to prevent this from ever happening again. The borders of Europe were completely redrawn. Global institutions like the United Nations were established in October of 1945, and to foster deep economic cooperation instead of endless warfare, the European Coal and Steel Committee was formed, which eventually evolved into the modern European Union, practically erasing borders between former enemies. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pivotal question to think about. How did the redrawn borders of Europe and the creation of the United Nations prevent World War III? Think about how the incredible sacrifices, the shifting alliances, and the hard-won lessons of World War II directly shaped the institutions and the relative peace of the modern world we live in today. History doesn't just sit in the past, right? It builds the very foundation of our present. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this incredible piece of history.